The stone is slick beneath her knees, not from rain, from something worse. She tries to lift her head, tries to meet the eyes of the crowd pressing closer. But a hand forces her down, grinding her face toward the filth pooling between the forum's ancient stones. The smell hits her first. Rotting vegetables, fish entrails, human waste baking under the midday sun. Then comes the bucket. Thick, warm liquid cascades over her skull, and the reek of stable manure floods her senses. The crowd erupts not in horror, but in laughter. Children push forward for a better view. A senator adjusts his immaculate toga and smiles. This is justice. Roman justice. And what they're doing to her is only the beginning. Before we go any further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching this from. It honestly amazes me every single time that a story buried in ruins for 2,000 years can reach people across every continent, every time zone, all hungry for the truth that history tried to hide. This is Rome at the height of its power. The Pax Romana stretches from the fog-shrouded forests of Britain to the sun-scorched deserts of Mesopotamia. Aqueducts carry fresh water to 1 million souls. Philosophers debate in marble halls. Poets immortalize emperors in verse. This is the civilization that gave the world its legal foundations, its concepts of citizenship and rights, its very language of law. Yet beneath those marble facades, behind those columns tourists photograph at sunset, Rome perfected something else entirely: punishments so psychologically devastating, so deliberately dehumanizing that even the executioners sometimes turned away. These weren't accidents of barbarism. They were policy, theater, entertainment, and the records that survive buried in monastery archives. Scratched into prison walls, whispered in the horrified writings of witnesses who couldn't stay silent, will a truth more disturbing than simple cruelty. They reveal a civilization that understood exactly what it was doing, and did it anyway. The woman convulsing in the Forum Center has been convicted of adultery. Her punishment won't be the sword too quick to clean. Not crucifixion either, which at least granted condemned criminals the dignity of being remembered, of dying upright against the sky. No, Rome has designed something more elaborate for her, something that will transform her from a human being into a public lesson in degradation. This is the fustigatio, the ritual humiliation parade. But it's only one thread in a vast tapestry of suffering that Rome wove with the same precision it applied to its roads and laws. Consider what happened to Rome's most sacred women when they fell from grace. The Vestal Virgins were the empire's spiritual guardians, keepers of the eternal flame that symbolically protected every citizen. They walked streets where consuls stepped aside in deference. They held legal privileges no other women possessed: the right to own property, to make binding oaths, to sit in places of honor at the games. They were, in every sense, untouchable. Until they weren't. If a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, whether the accusation was true, fabricated by political enemies, or extracted through torture from supposed witnesses, Rome's response revealed something fundamental about how power treats the sacred when it becomes inconvenient. They would lead her beyond the city walls to the Campus Celeratus, the field of wickedness. There they had prepared a chamber, not a prison cell, not an execution ground. Something worse. A narrow shaft descended into earth, barely wider than a coffin stood on end. The chamber at its base was perhaps 8 feet across. Inside, the priests would place a small oil lamp, a jug of water, a loaf of bread. Then they would guide the Vestal down the ladder. She would descend into darkness while Rome's high priests proclaimed that they were not executing her. How could they spill sacred blood? They were merely confining her, leaving her with the means of survival. What happened next was between her and the gods. The stone door would scrape shut. The lamp would flicker, casting shadows that danced on walls, pressing close as a tomb. She would have hours, maybe a day, to watch that flame, the only light she would ever see again. Then the oil would run out, In the absolute darkness that followed, she would feel her way to the bread, to the water. She would ration what couldn't be rationed. Count breaths in the silence. Listen to footsteps passing overhead, citizens discussing theater, philosophy, the price of grain while she starved in the dark beneath their feet. The psychological architecture of this punishment was masterful in its cruelty. She wasn't being killed. She was being erased. Sealed beneath the city she had served, forgotten while still breathing. Left to understand with perfect clarity that Rome had moved on without her, that her body would rot here, unmourned and unrecorded, until Earth reclaimed what was left. Archaeologists have found these chambers. The bones tell stories the official histories never recorded: scratch marks on walls where fingernails broke against stone, lamp oil residue from flames that burned down to nothing, the small water jugs still lying where they fell empty. But at least the Vestals died in darkness, away from eyes. Other punishments were designed for spectacle, for the satisfaction of crowds who gathered expecting entertainment and received, instead, something that blurred every line between justice and theater. They called it ponikolaitha, punishment of the sack. It was reserved for those convicted of parricidium, the murder of one's own parents, the ultimate violation of Rome's sacred family structure. The condemned would be stripped and bound. Then they would be forced into a heavy leather sack. But they wouldn't enter alone. First, guards would shove in a dog snarling, terrified, already biting. Then a rooster, wings beating frantically in the confined space, its spurs raking anything they touched. A monkey shrieking with panic, its claws sharp and indiscriminate. Finally, a serpent, its body coiling reflexively around whatever it found, striking blindly in the chaos. Then they would force the human inside and seal the opening with iron clasps. The accounts that survived describe the sound, muffled screams mixing with animal shrieks, the leather bulging and thrashing as bodies collided in blind terror. Inside was heat, darkness, the overwhelming stench of animal musk and human sweat. Claws raked flesh, fangs struck whatever moved. The rooster's beak jabbed at eyes. The dog bit throats, arms, anything. The snake coiled tighter around limbs, around necks. And the human, unable to see, unable to defend against attacks from all sides, would claw at leather that wouldn't tear, at stitching that held fast, while the mob outside watched the sack dance across the stones like some grotesque parody of life. When the thrashing finally stilled, when the sounds faded to wet gasping, and then to nothing, they would drag the sack to the Tiber and throw it in. No grave, no rites, no record. The body would wash out to sea with Rome's sewage, erased from memory as thoroughly as from earth. The cruelty was symbolic, yes, reducing the parricida to the level of beasts, casting them from humanity itself. But there was something else at work, something visible in the accounts of senators who attended these executions. They laughed. They found it absurd. This mixture of man and monkey and snake. The punishment satisfied an appetite for spectacle, for watching dignity not just destroyed, but made ridiculous. And Rome found even more creative ways to blend death with performance art. In the amphitheaters, during the Ludi Meridiani, the midday executions between gladiator, flight's condemned prisoners would sometimes be forced to act out mythological scenes, but with a twist that audiences loved. The deaths were real. A woman convicted of adultery might play Dido, the tragic queen. She'd wear the costume, speak the lines, perform the gestures. But when the script called for Dido to take her own life, the guards would hand her a real dagger. The crowd would lean forward. Would she do it? The hesitation was part of the show. If she refused, soldiers would guide her hand, forcing the blade into her chest while she screamed an improvisation the audience appreciated. The blood spreading across her costume wasn't stage paint. The convulsions as she died weren't acting. Theater and execution merged into something Rome convinced itself was both. Others were cast as Orpheus, given a lyre to play as they entered the arena. The music would begin beautiful, and desperate. Then the bears would be released. The lyre would fall. The music would become screaming, and the crowd would debate whether the performance had been convincing, whether the condemned had truly captured Orpheus's tragic grace before the beasts tore him apart. The damnatio ad bestias condemnation to beasts became Rome's signature spectacle. But even here, degradation mattered as much as death. Sometimes prisoners would be smeared with animal entrails before being pushed into the arena, rotting offal clinging to their skin, drawing predators with scent as much as movement. Lions starved for days would tear into the condemned with a frenzy that had crowds on their feet. But what made spectators gasp wasn't just the violence. It was watching a human reduced to bait, to nothing more than meat wrapped in the guts of slaughtered livestock. Guards would drape intestines over prisoners' shoulders like grotesque garlands. They'd stuff pieces of liver into mouths until the condemned gagged and vomited. Flies would swarm instantly, a black, buzzing cloud that followed the prisoner as they stumbled across the sand. When the beasts finally struck, tearing through both offal and flesh, it was almost a mercy. An end to the humiliation that had become worse than the fear of death itself. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating punishment was one that didn't require elaborate staging. It required only patience, sewage. And Rome's greatest engineering achievement turned into an instrument of horror: the Cloaca Maxima. Rome's great sewer was a marvel, a tunnel system that drained waste from 1 million people, channeling it beneath the streets to the Tiber. Poets praised it as proof of Roman genius, of civilization triumphing over chaos. But in the lowest chambers, where torchlight barely penetrated and the air was thick with methane and decay, guards would sometimes chain prisoners directly to the walls. The water, if that word applies to the thick brown sludge flowing past, would rise and fall with the city's rhythms. Sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes to the waist. The prisoner would stand or crouch, but never lie down. Not in that. The ammonia would eat its skin, creating sores that wept and festered. Rats, huge from feeding on refuse, would swim past, occasionally stopping to investigate what new thing had been chained here. The prisoner's eyes would swell shut from the fumes. Their throat would bleed from coughing. Infections would set in within days, turning flesh black around the fetters. The cruelest part was that rescue was theoretically possible. The sewer had entrances. Guards passed through on inspections, but they never came for prisoners. Traitors sentenced to the cloaca were simply left there until the fetters held only bone, and even the rats had lost interest. Their bodies would eventually wash into the Tiber with the rest of Rome's refuse, recordized, unmourned, erased. The writer Juvenal referenced these sewer deaths with barely concealed disgust, noting how Rome's justice could reduce a man to less than the filth he drowned in. But his complaints changed nothing. The practice continued because it served a purpose beyond punishment. It was erasure. To die in Rome's sewers was to be flushed from history itself, to become literally indistinguishable from waste. Other punishments focused on prolonging agony through public degradation. The furca, wooden fork placed around the neck, would be used to parade criminals through streets while crowds pelted them with refuse. But Rome refined even this simple humiliation. Sometimes the condemned would be stripped naked and covered in honey, then left bound in the forum during summer. Wasps and hornets would descend, stinging exposed flesh until the prisoner's face swelled beyond recognition. Flies would lay eggs in the wounds. By evening, the prisoner would be covered in a living mass of insects, their screams muffled by swollen tongues, their bodies convulsing with anaphylactic shock. Witnesses described how the crowds would initially laugh, then grow quiet as the hours passed and the prisoner's suffering crossed from entertainment into something more disturbing. Yet no one would intervene. To show mercy was to question Rome's justice. And Rome's justice, however revolting, was absolute. The Tarpeian rock offered a different kind of horror sit-in rather than prolonged, but no less degrading. Traitors would be marched up the Capitoline Hill, The climb itself a ritual humiliation as crowds jeered and threw stones. At the summit, they'd be stripped naked and hurled from the cliff. The fall took only seconds, but those seconds stretched into eternity. The rush of air, the crowd's roar fading, the rocks rising up with terrible clarity. The impact would shatter bones like pottery. Bodies would land broken, limbs twisted at impossible angles, blood pooling among the stones. But death wasn't always instant. Some survived the fall, gasping through punctured lungs, unable to move as dogs approached. Rome left the bodies where they fell, denying burial, letting carrion birds pick them clean. The message was clear: betray Rome, and you become refuse, your bones scattered among the rubbish at the city's feet. Yet for all these horrors, there was one punishment that combined nearly every element of Rome's sadistic creativity, the execution reserved for the most despised criminals. The ones Rome wanted not just dead, but obliterated from memory. They would be taken to the amphitheater, dressed as mythological figures, and forced to perform elaborate pantomimes while intricate torture devices slowly killed them. One account describes a prisoner playing Prometheus. He was chained to a post in the arena center, his chest bare. Then an eagle-trained, starved, vicious was released. The bird would land on the prisoner and begin tearing at his abdomen, ripping through skin and muscle to reach organs beneath. The prisoner's screams would echo through the amphitheater while announcers explained the myth to spectators, drawing parallels between ancient punishment and modern justice. The eagle would feed until the prisoner's movements stilled, pecking at liver and intestines while the crowd cheered or gagged or both. These spectacles could last hours. The condemned would be revived if they lost consciousness too quickly. Wounds would be cauterized to prevent rapid blood loss. The goal wasn't execution, it was performance. The prisoner had to live long enough for the myth to play out completely, for the crowd to feel they'd received full value from the spectacle. What united all these punishments was a philosophy that extended beyond deterrence or retribution. Rome was feeding something darker, an appetite for watching others stripped of dignity, reduced to objects of mockery and disgust. The elite who ordered these executions weren't sadists in the clinical sense. They were products of a system that had normalized cruelty. That had convinced itself degradation was justice, that the screams of the condemned were the sound of civilization defending itself. Seneca, who preached virtue and mercy, remained complicit in Rome's brutality. He condemned the games, yet continued attending imperial events where people died. He wrote philosophical treatises while prisoners drowned in sewers beneath his villa. The contradiction never moved him to resist. He stayed, benefited, and rationalized. That is the haunting truth of Roman punishment, not just its cruelty, but its normalization. Citizens discussed sewer executions over dinner, judged the artistry of staged mythological deaths, joked about the parasita sewn into sacks. Violence blended into daily life like fountain water and street vendors' calls. Ecology preserves the traces. Grooves in stones were chains war channels. Fetters rusted into sewer walls. Chambers where vestals were sealed. Their bones mixed with lamps and crumbs of ancient bread. These are not legends, but evidence of a culture that paired poetry with drowning prisoners, beauty with engineered suffering. Rome's fall didn't end these practices. Medieval Europe inherited and expanded them: the rack, the wheel. Public mutilation continuing Rome's belief that punishment was theater, and that justice could serve appetites unrelated to law. The shadow stretched into centuries of public executions, treated as communal entertainment. Today, tourists photograph the Colosseum glowing at sunset by miniature columns, praise Roman engineering. But under those stones lie erased stories. Dragged bodies, sealed girls, prisoners washed from sewers into the sea. Rome shaped our architecture, our law, our language, but also our capacity to hide cruelty behind grandeur. The stones remember what we try to forget, that civilizations often place beauty above humanity, and judge themselves by their monuments rather than by how they treat the unseen lives in the darkness beneath them.